Hello, and welcome to the Circular Economy 101 webinar that kicks off the Circular Trailblazer Program. I'd like to acknowledge today and thank the members of the Coquitlam First Nations as I'm delivering the webinar today from their unceded traditional territory, and also the Squamish First Nations, whose territory is where the Trailblazer Program is located. I think this acknowledgement is particularly relevant for this webinar and program because Indigenous practices and knowledges are intrinsically linked to circular economy through their deep-rooted principles of sustainability and resource stewardship and a holistic understanding of our sort of interconnectedness with nature and ecosystems. I'm co-delivering today's webinar with Sue Maxwell, who is the principal of Eco Inspire Consulting. Do you want to say a quick hello, Sue?
Sure. Thanks, Rosemary. And I am here on the unceded traditional territories of both the Squamish and Lil'wat peoples.
Thanks, Sue. So just a bit about myself briefly. I transitioned my sustainability-focused career to the circular economy in 2013. And since then, I've taught the circular economy to business students at BCIT and supported them to work with businesses to go through the 5 steps to circular success that this program is based on. And I've served as the director of 2 nonprofits focused on the circular economy. So that means I've supported a range of businesses, government, and nonprofits to advance circular innovations for consumer goods, electronics, textiles, packaging, construction, and the food sector. And so this is what we're going to be covering in today's webinar. We're going to start with an overview of the program. Before defining the circular economy and sort of its 4 key principles, as well as talk about some of the benefits that businesses and organizations can gain from embracing circular practices. And then we'll share some successful examples for each of the 4 key circular principles. We're going to ask you then to consider strategic reasons that are relevant to you to embrace circular practices, including both benefits to be gained and also risks to be avoided or reduced over the sort of next 3 to 5 years. And then we'll finish with some next steps and some homework that we'd like you to consider completing before attending the next workshop in the Trailblazer program. So the purpose of the Trailblazer program is really quite straightforward. It's to support Squamish businesses and organizations to embrace circular economy practices in order to gain advantages, but also to meet social and environmental goals. And this Circular Economy 101 webinar is intended to be available to Trailblazer participants that were unable to attend the first workshop, or those who may want to review the content. It feeds into workshop 2, where you'll go through a process to come up with a list of potential circular opportunities for your business or organization, which you'll then assess to determine the best opportunities with support from members of the WCS team. In the fall, there'll be a workshop focused on implementation strategies, focused by a recognition ceremony. So in brief, the Trailblazer program takes participants through 5 steps. The first is you really want to kind of identify your circular advantages. And I think of this as the why bother step. What strategic risks can you avoid or reduce? And what benefits can you gain by going through the rest of the steps? The diagnose value chain, this is where you go through a process to uncover your untapped circular value, something that I'll define for you briefly, for a specific product line, or it could even be for your whole business or organization. Then you'll go through and brainstorm, what are those circular opportunities that you might advance? And then go through a process to assess them, because you want to identify the ones that are financially viable and technically feasible while also reducing waste and other environmental impacts. And then finally, you'll go through a process to kind of plan and implement your circular actions, lay them out in an action plan to move those best opportunities forward. So the Trailblazer program is based on work that's been undertaken by the District of Squamish, starting with the development of a circular economy roadmap that was focused on 3 sectors: food, textiles, and construction. In 2024, the district then developed an implementation plan that includes the Trailblazer program. Together with that, there's also a micro grant opportunity and a circular innovation challenge that I'll talk more about at the end of today's webinar. Everyone who participates in the Trailblazer program is eligible to apply for those grants. So what exactly is the circular economy anyway? Let's just jump right into what we mean by the definition here. There are lots of definitions of the circular economy out there, and this is one that I've pulled together from a variety of sources that I like. And we're basically saying it's an economic system, both of production, but also on the consumption side, that aims to keep products, components, materials at their highest utility and value. And that last word, value, is a really key concept in the circular economy that I'm going to tell you a little bit about next. So, in our linear economy, which is sometimes called the take, make, waste economy, we take resources, make them into products, and sell them to consumers. And as we do that, value is added at every step. During consumer use, the value of the product is at its highest. But after a relatively short lifespan, unfortunately, the value is often quickly destroyed, and it either goes to landfill, waste to energy, or recycling at best. And these linear business models or approaches are generally quite sales oriented. And so revenue comes from selling as many products as possible or things. So it makes sense that there's an incentive to design products with short lifespans in order to continuously sell new ones and generate revenue. But in contrast, the circular economy aims to retain added value for as long as possible, if not in perpetuity. And we're trying to design things, whether it's products or homes, to be long lasting and easy to maintain and repair and reuse, thus slowing down kind of resource loops and prolonging that use phase of things at the top of the value hill. And on the downhill journey, the idea is to go as slowly as possible so that the complete products or its components can be fed back into a previous phase, such as when a secondhand product goes back to the use phase. And these circular practices really represent a shift from an emphasis on quantity, producing as much stuff as possible, to quality, which may require shifts in business models or approaches, so that they're built around a product's life cycle and closing resource cycles or loops. So that's the high level stuff. And this is where we need to get into, like, what are the kind of key practices of the circular economy that allow us to maintain that value and stay at the top of that value hill? So there are 4 of them. And the first one is we want to narrow or use less or use fewer resources to deliver the same function or service, and really to try to dramatically minimize impact per product, per building. Second, we want to slow things down. We want to use things longer. We want to extend the life of products, buildings, and materials for as long as possible. And in doing so, really respect the resources and the carbon that went into making them in the first place. Third, we want to close. We want to close loops by maximizing opportunities for reuse, recovery, and recycling of materials to keep them in the economy as long as possible. And then finally, and this is really key in a world of overshoot that Sue's going to talk further about, we want to make things clean or to employ practices to improve or regenerate the natural environment. Now, recycling is absolutely a part of the circular economy, but it really kind of begins at the end or the get rid of stage of a product's life cycle. And, most closely aligned with that close principle. But really in the circular economy, we're really trying to go right back to the beginning to prevent waste and pollution from being created in the first place. So recycling, yeah, it's a necessary component. But I often think of it as sometimes an easy way in, but as the start of a circular journey where you want to continue to push upstream to those earlier principles around narrow and slow, as well as regenerate. And one of the reasons why this is important is that decisions made at the upfront stage of a product can determine around 80% of the environmental impacts. And so they're really important as we live in a world of overshoot. So with that, I'm going to now hand it over to Sue, and Sue is going to talk a little bit why businesses and organizations bother with the effort of embracing circular practices. Sue?
Thanks, Rosemary. Yeah, so there's many reasons that businesses would choose to go circular, and one of the key areas is to avoid linear risks. And in linear business systems, A lot of businesses are noticing increased exposure to these risks. So, to avoid them, uh, people are choosing to go circular. So, one of the key ones is supply chain shocks. And so, particularly as Rosemary mentioned, in a world in ecological overshoot, we're experiencing challenges in that. So, COVID showed us how impactful these can be to business operations. But also, we've seen that from extreme weather events where the ability to move materials has been impacted. Raw material scarcity and volatility is also a key one. For example, with cement, there is now shortages because of a lack of beach sand that is needed to make the cement. Labor shortages are another key ones, making the risk of losing employees to better companies with more sustainable practices a real risk. We are also seeing changes in policies and laws. So, for example, municipalities can impose bans as landfills are getting closer to capacity. And we can anticipate bans for textiles, construction materials beyond just gypsum, perhaps for things like wood and concrete and asphalt. So, considering these linear risks can be really important. We also see that many businesses are choosing, next slide, please, Rosemary, are choosing to go circular because they want to gain circular benefits. And many of these are really the flip side of the risks that we just mentioned. So you can get enhanced supply chain resilience, greater stability of material inputs and pricing, the ability to save money, enhance brand reputation, optimizing innovation opportunities, and improving customer loyalty, and also getting new customers, and also attracting and retaining quality employees. As studies have shown that many employees are choosing the companies to work for that more closely align with their values, where sustainability is important to them. And also, as we mentioned, staying ahead of and complying with regulations so that those don't come as surprises and risks. Next slide, please. And so, in the broader context, why we as society or we as businesses may choose to go circular is this ecological overshoot that Rosemary mentioned. And this diagram really outlines the donut economics model. And in donut economics, the outer ring is the ecological ceiling. So basically, the ability of the planet to support society. And components of that would be things like climate change, biodiversity, land conversion, pollution, ocean acidification, and many others. Of the ones that are measured, you can see that several of them on the outside are red. So that's showing that we are already putting too much greenhouse gases into the environment. For climate change or biodiversity loss, we've already exceeded what would be considered a safe level. For some of the ones in gray, air pollution and chemical pollution, so far there hasn't been determined what a safe level would be. But the bottom line is we are using more resources on the planet than the planet can sustain at this level, and we are polluting it more than the planet is, the systems are able to clean it. On the inner circle, which is the social component, in order for us to have a thriving society, we all need things like air and clean water and food and energy. We also need health, and it's important to have a political voice and social equity and gender equity. And you can see on many of those components, we are also not meeting the needs of society. But in an ideal goal, we would be having the donut economy, which would have us in that green circle in the middle, which essentially we are meeting the needs of society but not using so many resources that the planet can't sustain it. And this is a concept developed by Kate Raworth. Um, and so this is sort of our goal and also the rationale between businesses making changes. Next slide, please. But also we've highlighted that climate change is one of the key problems that we are facing today. And while we often kind of think it's like, well, it's about buildings and transportation, which is true, um, an analysis from a systems perspective by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation with this circular diagram shown here showed that 45% of the greenhouse gases are really about making materials and products for us. And some of them, like steel, cement, aluminum, plastic, are either fossil fuel based or very energy intense. So it makes sense for us to choose the materials and use the materials as long as possible to help save that carbon footprint. Another way of thinking about it is this quote on the left, that 2/3 of emissions are embodied in the production of goods before you buy them. So sometimes we're quite concerned when we're purchasing something about, oh, is this the most energy efficient appliance? And we should focus on that. But we also should think that in the choice to purchase something, a huge amount of emissions are um, already have been made in the production of those materials. And so we like to think of it as a little carbon or ecological backpack of on each product for what its scale of impact is. And so if we can reduce that impact, or if we can make a product that already has an impact last as long as possible, that then helps with the climate change role. And so now I'm going to turn it back to Rosemary. There we
Great.
go.
Thanks so much, Sue. So in this next step of the phase of the presentation, I'm going to go over some circular business examples and advantages for each of those 4 principles. And these are these 4 principles: narrow, slow, close, and regenerate. And the first one, narrow, again, is strategies to reduce the consumption of virgin resources and the carbon used in the production process, which can be quite a large percentage of the carbon in the life cycle of a product. And as you listen to this next session, just sort of consider, are you already doing something that aligns with the narrow principle, or would you like to consider adopting anything that aligns with these narrow principles? So the first sort of practice in the narrow category is called material substitution. And here, what we're doing is we're trying to favor and use salvaged or recycled materials versus using virgin resources that need to be newly extracted from nature and used for the first time. So a couple of examples is we're increasingly seeing builders using salvaged lumber taken from deconstructed homes and commercial buildings. And this lumber sequestered carbon, which would otherwise be released if the wood were discarded or decomposing in the landfill, but it also reduces the need to log new timber. And one of the other advantages is in places like the city of Vancouver, salvage wood is actually counting towards regulatory requirements to use low carbon building materials, as found in things like the Climate Emergency Plan, but also specifically in the embodied carbon strategy. Anion is a really tremendous clothing company on Vancouver Island that uses entirely salvaged material, natural material, in fact, wood fiber, textiles from discarded clothing picked up from landfills. And there's no regulation forcing them to do this. However, they're likely saving money compared to purchasing new materials. And recycled wool avoids the land and kind of water-intensive processes needed to raise and graze sheep, not to mention that they're really gassy animals, actually, who produce quite a lot of methane. And it also avoids the energy, water, and chemicals that are needed to transform virgin wool into dyed usable fabric. So all of this actually makes Anion, really a sustainable company that is really quite attractive to employees who want to work for a company with strong sustainable practices. Not only do they want to work there, but they want to stay there. And that addresses some of the labor shortages we've been seeing. For those who were able to attend the kickoff, we heard from Goodly Food, who makes soups out of slightly imperfect, tomatoes and excess squash and oversupplied potatoes or beets that would otherwise be discarded. And they get this food for free. So that is really quite a significant cost saver, obviously. And for those they buy it from, they likely avoid the disposal fees that they would normally have to pay to comply with things like food waste bans. But there also allows them to be really flexible because they change their production based on wherever they're finding food surplus, which gives them an advantage in terms of supply chain resilience. So another form of material substance in the narrow category is favoring renewable, low impact, and abundant materials instead of ones that are non-renewable, high impact, or scarce. So we're seeing more cross-laminated timber used in buildings. Legally, you're allowed to do this up to 12 stories right now, and there's a potential change of bringing it up to 18 stories. And cross-laminated boards use sections of lumber that would traditionally have been discarded as being too small. And obviously, it's a renewable material that actually has a lower carbon footprint than concrete, anywhere from 15 to 30% lower. So I don't know if anybody, if you have a bamboo t-shirt out there instead of a cotton one, but it's an alternate material that you can use, often used by fairly, progressive or sustainability-based clothing companies. And what bamboo has been shown to use significantly less water to grow. It's highly land efficient because it grows in quite dense areas and quite rapidly. And it can grow on marginal lands that are unsuitable for food production. But it also has the benefit of appealing to consumers who our research at the Share Reuse Repair Initiative, where I'm the director, and a lot of others, show that many consumers are really expecting companies to produce things that are in line with sustainability values. So it's really kind of responding to those changing consumer expectations. Finally, we're starting to see some interesting new developments in the food sector where insects are becoming an alternate source of protein to things like beef or dairy. And insects have a much larger carbon and ecological footprint, but they have the added advantage of reducing competition for scarce agricultural resources like land, water, and feed, and can use diverse feed sources like organic waste and even agricultural byproducts, which reduces reliance on feedstocks like corn and soy. So not only is that responding to changing consumer expectations, but it's also sort of allowing these companies to reduce raw material scarcity risks. So the next one that we want to do in narrow is called material efficiency. And you might not think of this as circular, but it's a part of the circular practices. And it's, how can you simply use less material and energy in your business or organization through design, technology, or production changes? So one example of that is prefab construction that we're seeing in the building industry, where parts of a building are constructed off-site in a factory setting, and that allows them to minimize the material waste compared to traditional on-site construction methods. They have really precise planning and design, which can, reduce overall consumption, but you can have cost savings in these practices, in these factory approaches as well. There's another process called on-demand production, and that really means we have manufacturing processes where garments or shoes are produced in response to specific customer orders, which really minimizes what's called dead stock or excess inventory and associated waste. And Cotton is a Canadian company that does this using the on-demand production. And it's also increasingly in demand by kind of, sustainability savvy consumers. Finally, because we had the kickoff event at the House on Brewing Company, we're starting to see a lot of focus in breweries that are adopting what's called mash filters to separate the wort from the mash in the brewing process. And by doing this, they not only produce higher quality beer, higher quantity of beer, which is very good for your TGIF, but also it really significantly reduces water usage. And that's really important as we face increasing sort of drought conditions and water shortages. And that can be a real kind of factor in the resilience of their production processes. And so those two first ones are sort of some of the easier ways that you can get into narrow principles. But sometimes, in the circular economy, we actually really want to focus on redesigning things, redesigning them to be more durable, repairable, and then to allow for the effective reuse and recovery of materials. One example in the diagram here was done by Nexi, which has a prefab manufacturing plant in Squamish using a low carbon proprietary material called Nexite. They built and disassembled a 700 square foot laneway house in 6 days. And using strategies like using bolts instead of glue and labeling and categorizing everything. And they got, it resulted in like close to a 99.8% diversion from landfill versus demolition, which is really significant. And, obviously, if you're reusing things, you have incredible security of material inputs if you're using what already exists, but it allows you to get ahead of embodied carbon regulations, and you're focusing on an innovation that is increasingly in demand. We're seeing a lot of focus on care and repair, particularly in the textile sector, where customers are expecting that when something is sold to them, they're giving instructions on how to care for it, but also there are repair instructions and services that are available. And I think the important thing in here is that why sell a jacket once when you can sell it twice? You can sell it a second time as a pre-loved item. And this also contributes to customer loyalty because the original customer is going to come back and resell their secondhand item, get a credit to buy something new, but you will also get new customers that are interested in those secondhand items, not the new ones. And finally, another one that we're really seeing is it's not just about the products, it's about the services that allow us to reuse things. And we're seeing a trend towards new companies that are supporting the reuse of coffee cups and containers for takeout food and even containers in grocery stores. For example, we have a company called Sharewares based in Vancouver, and they obviously have the benefit of helping respond to single-use item regulations and helping those that they serve. But they're also creating a whole new business that supports the collection, washing, and redistribution of cups and containers. Another one based out of BC is called Reusables. And finally, sometimes in the narrow category, we actually focus on creating entirely new business models that are really allowing us to use products between multiple users with the goal of reducing individual ownership and therefore the need to produce so many things. So sharing models is one example of this. And the classic ones are things like Airbnb or even Uber and tool libraries, where an individual owns something. And instead of it just sitting around not being used, they essentially rent it out to other people. And then multiple people can use the tool or the car rather than just one person. Turo is sort of like an Airbnb version for cars that we're starting to see in Canada, but a little bit more dominant in the US. But the other one is product as service. It's slightly different because the ownership stays actually with a company or a platform that provides the items to users through, again, a rental process essentially, and they ultimately have responsibility for the maintenance, repair, and the end-of-life disposal. And a couple of examples are Frockbox. It's a Canadian company. You get a personalized monthly subscription box with a selection of clothing items tailored to your style. And another one is meal subscription foods. You get pre-portioned ingredients and easy to follow recipes, again on a sort of subscription model. So you might want to take a pause here and think about, are you already doing things that adhere to these narrow practices? Maybe you're not calling it that, or are there any that you would like to consider adopting, linked to material efficiency and substitution, circular design, or circular business models? If you did pause, welcome back. If you didn't, we're just going to continue on to the next principle, which is slow. And this is really the main goal, is to use products, buildings, and materials for as long as possible to extend their life. And there are a variety of practices in here. One of them is really kind of just to simply set things up so we use them for longer. We're seeing a lot of care and repair services and education in the clothing sector, certainly, but also in bike repair, where you provide service centers, but also advice on bike care, maintenance, and how to do upgrades instead of buy new things. The other area we're really seeing this in is electronics. We're seeing mobile phones by Mobile Clinic, where they have repair services. But there's also the category of take back and resale sale of pre-owned items. And this can be for used furniture, used shoes, even outdoor gear, increasingly by companies like Arc'teryx, Patagonia, and North Face. IKEA has an option now where you can take back some of their furniture and it goes into their as is section for resale as pre-loved. And again, customers get a credit that they can use at the store. And customers are wanting, consumers in Canada are increasingly wanting and expecting these types of practices to happen. And not only do they create new revenue streams, but they meet circularity goals and they also increase customer loyalty, which is a bonus. And and finally, we just want to other set of practices are we can upcycle, recycle, and remanufacturing things. Upcycle is a little bit of circular economy jargon, but what it means is we're aiming to create higher value products from materials that are no longer desired, waste materials. You can see in Sweden, actually, this is one of my favorite examples. Rotuna Mall is a mall with 100% pre-loved and upcycled items located right next to a municipal transfer station. And what I think is interesting about this is they take some items like chest of drawers and things like that that we might otherwise dispose of, and they kind of make them into funky things that are desirable for folks to purchase. Refurbishment is a practice where we inspect, we repair, and we restore things to working condition, and then they are resold to customers. They're checked for quality and they're sold at varying prices. It's mostly electronic. So my mobile phone was from Mobile Clinic, and that's an example where they've got a whole range of different options in various conditions that you can purchase secondhand. Remanufacturing is a little bit different. It's a little bit more extensive restoration process compared to refurbished items. They're actually fully disassembled down to their core components, then thoroughly cleaned, inspected, and rebuilt using new or reconditioned parts to the place where they actually meet or exceed the original specifications with really stringent quality control and often the original type of warranty. These things are done for quite high value or items, things like turbochargers for heavy vehicles, industrial pumps, high-end medical equipment, and those types of things. So just a moment to pause here and say, are you already using practices that adhere to the slow principle? You might be and didn't know it was circular, or has this presentation of ideas prompted you to consider those that you might want to adopt in your business or organization? As I said, you feel free to take a pause if you'd like to sort of write some of those things down. And with that, I'm now going to hand it over to Sue, who's going to go through the next two principles. Sue?
Great. Thank you, Rosemary. And next slide. So we're going to talk about closing the loop using again, and that will be through using end-of-life materials as resources, and organic materials management and recycling. Next slide, please. And so some good examples of using existing materials as resource inputs for new processes are this one on the left, which is Chop Value. So that's a company in Vancouver that takes chopsticks, which have already been used for their original purpose, and making those into new products that have good value. Deconstruction is another example. So a company called Unbuilders, which takes apart, deconstructs homes, and then recovers the valuable materials, including things like beautiful wood beams, and those can be used in another building. Rosemary's already pointed out Goodly Foods, which is taking food that would otherwise be going to waste and making it into food products. So those are existing materials that would otherwise go to waste that are being used as inputs. And then in terms of organics material management, considering things like compostable fiber packaging, which can then go back in and be composted in the useful loop of organics materials. Next slide, please. We also have recycling. Although, as Rosemary had talked about upcycling, downcycling is often what happens when we recycle materials. And downcycling is where you take something, say, for example, this white office paper, and when it gets recycled, it's not going to go back into white office paper. It'll become something like cardboard. And that's because when you recycle the paper, you need to de-ink it, you need to take the staples out. And as you recycled paper, each time it gets recycled, the fibers get slightly shorter, so you cannot indefinitely recycle paper. You will always need some virgin materials to be inputted to it. Also, similarly for plastics, it's very rare to be able to recycle a food grade plastic into another food grade plastic. Often they will be made into things like some sort of fiber, like fleece is a good example, or plastic lumber, park benches, things like that. So it's very difficult to keep the materials at the same level. And that's why recycling is generally seen as something that is valuable to do, but not necessarily your first choice because there's better ways to keep the value of the material or product. Next slide, please. And so we also want to touch base on regenerate and making clean. And that will include the concepts of using non-toxic materials, using renewable energy and materials, and regenerating natural systems. And so making things clean. So for example, food production without chemicals. So if you're having organic food, then you're not adding toxic chemicals into the food production. Similarly, Ecologist, which is a clothing company that makes clothes using natural materials, and they actually have the third-party certification to ensure ethical and environmental best practices. And so they avoid plastics wherever possible. Another example shown here is Native, which is using renewable materials. So it's only plant-based materials that are going into their shoes. So using materials like eucalyptus or pineapple husk or other natural fibers. These materials are sourced sustainably and have lower environmental impacts compared to traditional synthetic materials. Because they've made a commitment to sustainability, it is enhancing their brand value, will appeal to consumers seeking environmentally friendly products, and potentially driving that brand loyalty and repeat purchases. In terms of renewable energy, what is interesting is the example of IKEA, where they have done some very comprehensive and multifaceted efforts to progress towards their 100% renewable energy goal. And so they've invested heavily in solar and wind power. 25 of the IKEA retail markets are now 100% renewable energy. But they've also gone beyond that across the supply chain. So they've been working with factories and suppliers. And so they've got 100% renewable energy or electricity, sorry, at 142 additional factories and suppliers. So they're kind of creating a ripple effect throughout the supply chain by focusing on this. Next slide, please. And then regenerating natural systems. And this is really within that context of us being in overshoot. It's important to not just do no harm, but actually repair some of the damage that has happened. And so, for example, IKEA has contributed to removing carbon from the atmosphere through reforestation and better forest management practices. And that has included funding rewilding of First Nations land in Alberta through a partnership with a nonprofit. Nature's Path is a cereal company based in Delta, and they've made commitments to source from farms that practice regenerative agriculture. This is because they recognize that regenerative organic practices heal and enrich the soil that supports the growth of our food and us, as well as capturing carbon from the atmosphere and sequestering it in the ground, which then helps to address climate change. Similarly, Persephone Brewing, that some of you might be familiar with, based in Gibsons, it's a farm brewery that employs regenerative agriculture practices. So those would be things like no-till farming and the use of non-toxic pesticides and fertilizers. So that also improves the soil health, increases biodiversity, and captures the carbon in the soil. So and the next slide is just going to show that or give you a time to reflect. If you are using any of the closing the loop or regenerative practices already within your model, and if there's any that you would consider adopting. And once you've had a chance to consider that, I'm going to pass it back to Rosemary.
Thanks so much, Sue. Yeah, so in the workshop that I know some of you weren't able to attend, we did an exercise called the Circular Business Advantage exercise, and that's where there was an opportunity to consider the circular advantages that businesses or organizations hope to achieve through going through this program, both the risks to avoid or reduce and the benefits to amplify or pursue. And so we would like you to use the Circular Business Advantage Activity Worksheet that was emailed you to consider the following questions. You can go through and say, what linear risks would you like to avoid? Write those down. You know, are they regulations coming around the corner? Are you concerned about material scarcity? And then the other part of it is, what circular benefits do you want to amplify and or pursue? Are you seeking a more resilient supply chain because you're concerned about some of the shocks that you've already experienced and that you feel might continue as we live in a world facing climate change? Are you looking to save money? Sometimes saving money, you know, particularly if there might be new disposal fees or increased costs of the inputs for what you make or the services you provide. Why do you want to address these risks and benefits? What's important about doing this now? And these are really like you're also thinking strategically in this exercise over the next sort of 3 to 5 years. You want to look a little bit into the future just to anticipate what might be coming down the pipe for you. And is this spurring on any new circular ideas? Are you already getting a sense of what circular practices you might want to pursue? So an example might be, you know, that you're a company that's concerned about regulations, particularly, for example, single-use items regulations already exist, and they might be becoming even more stringent. And a response that you might have to that is you might want to pursue a reusable container system. Another one that we see a lot in the circular economy is material scarcity. Do you have any materials that you're concerned that are going to become more scarce and could potentially also become higher price? For example, you know, in the cement industry, beach sand is critical to making cement, and it's actually running out globally. So you're seeing cement companies switching to the use of recycled cement as a response to that challenge. Other benefits, as I said before, you know, supply chain resilience. We're seeing all these extreme weather events that are disrupting supply chains more often. A response that might be there is to switch to more localized suppliers for key materials or inputs. I did mention the one about saving money, can be related to many things. I think disposal fees is one of the really obvious things. But can you find a partner or an approach to take those spent materials as a resource to avoid paying those disposal fees? So please go through, and we'd ask you to please go through the effort of filling out that Circular Business Advantage worksheet before you come to workshops 2. And so I'm just going to go back a slide. You please feel free to email the worksheet to Kim. You can see her email there. And that just helps us know what you're focusing on and can support you better as we move into the second workshop. So I did mention at the beginning of this that there is a couple of grants that Trailblazers can apply to. One of them is called the Circular Trailblazer Micro Grant. It's an opportunity to apply for up to $5,000 per entity. There's a total funding available of $50,000. And really the goal is to support businesses, nonprofits, and organizations to shift and embrace circular practices. There's a whole variety of grant activities that you can pursue. You can do waste audits. You can invest in equipment that can support waste reduction or circular efforts. But you can also use these funds towards circular business planning or continuing to develop your circular strategy as you go through the Trailblazer program. Some of that assessment of the best opportunities requires a little bit of financial viability or technical feasibility assessment. You might want to do something where you're really determining if the environmental impacts across the life cycle of a new practice are actually lower than an alternative one. You can do staff training, and really just in short, the projects must align with the circular principles that we've talked about today. The application deadline is still being determined, but you will receive an email about this opportunity. So watch out for that. The other one that is available is called the Circular Economy Innovation Challenge Program. And again, this is to stimulate circular practices. But it's really got a little bit more of, they're seeking more of a focus on partnership solutions that could involve more than one entity and addressing what they're calling community issues or benefits that go beyond an individual entity and benefit the full community through a circular innovation lab. The funds available for this are a little bit more at 20,000 per applicant for a total funding pool of 60,000. And again, it's projects that align with the circular economy principles. That application deadline is still being determined. I believe it's earlier, and again, it will be sent to you in an email. So take a look for that one in your inbox as well. So there, we're coming to the end of our Circular Economy 101 webinar. And there was a part of workshop 1 that I know some of you were unable to attend. That's actually going to feed into workshop 2, where you will go through a process to determine where you might be losing circular value in the supply chain of your business or organization, and what are an initial list of circular ideas or opportunities that you could explore to capture that value, that might address some of your pain points or risks that you want to avoid or reduce, or advance various benefits for your business or organization. Please, you can see dates there. There's one being held on July 10th, but there's the option for one on September 9th, 10th, or 12th. We would like you to finish the Circular Advantage worksheet and email it to Kim before that. Workshop 2. In the fall, we'll have workshop 3 focused on implementation strategies and a recognition ceremony. You can pause the webinar here and use this QR code. And there's a survey that pops up where you can let us know, are you ready to jump in and go to workshop 2 on July 10th? Or would you like to go to a second workshop in September? If so, what is your preference for the date? There will be one workshop held on the 9th, 10th, or 12th, and we want to determine the best option. And so with that, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that's given you a slice of the circular economy, what it's all about, what are some key principles and examples, and the benefits from engaging in this practice that should not only benefit your business or organization, but also have, broader benefits that allow us to collectively move towards what Sue described as a donut economy. Sue, would you like to say a few closing words as well?
Thank you, Rosemary. Just want to say thanks to everybody for attending this and looking forward to working with you furthermore this summer.
Okay.